Out of 1,347 Tiger tanks deployed during World War II, fewer than 200 survived the conflict intact. The men inside had a combat life expectancy of just 3 months, but they commanded what was simultaneously the most feared and most vulnerable weapon in the German arsenal. Their story is far more horrific than it seems, and now you're going to see why. When people talk about German armor in World War II, they usually mention the Panzer IV or the later Panther, but the Tiger was a different beast altogether. Weighing in at 57 tons, it was nearly twice as heavy as America's Sherman tank, making it a lumbering giant on the battlefield. But in 1943, that massive steel behemoth became both the pride of the Wehrmacht and a rolling coffin for thousands of young German tankers. The Germans needed it because of its firepower. As Allied armor improved, the standard 50mm and short 75mm guns struggled to penetrate their hulls at combat ranges. The Tiger's legendary 88mm gun could punch through 112mm of armor at 2 kilometers, meaning it could destroy any Allied tank while remaining safely out of their effective range. Even more importantly, if Germany wanted to hold ground against the overwhelming numbers of Soviet and American tanks, they needed something that could take out multiple enemies before being overwhelmed. The Allies, of course, knew all of this. They had no illusions about the danger Tigers presented on the battlefield. But instead of meeting them head-on like they had with other German tanks, they decided to approach this one differently. They studied the previous battles: Kursk, Tunisia, Sicily, and they learned that frontal assaults against Tigers didn't work. The 88mm gun would pick off attacking tanks long before they could get close enough to penetrate the Tiger's thick frontal armor. So this time, they went for the weak spots. Field commanders were experienced officers who understood the situation perfectly. They knew they weren't going to win by playing to the Tiger's strengths. They didn't even expect to match its firepower, but their goal was to exploit the tank's numerous vulnerabilities and neutralize its advantages. They figured that if they could force the Tiger to move quickly over rough terrain or flank it from the sides, they could overcome what seemed like an invincible machine. Allied intelligence estimated around 1,400 Tigers would be produced during the war. However, they underestimated how difficult these tanks would be to maintain and keep operational. And to make matters worse, nearly all of them suffered from catastrophic mechanical issues. Over 50% of Tiger tank losses weren't from enemy fire at all, but from mechanical failure, running out of fuel, or being abandoned by their crews when they couldn't be recovered. The tank's complexity made excavation of stuck vehicles nearly impossible in combat conditions. They built transmissions that failed, engines that overheated, and suspension systems that broke down after relatively short distances. Field commanders also had every inch of likely Tiger routes pre-measured. Artillery positions were already zeroed in on choke points and bridges that couldn't support the tank's massive weight. Firing lanes were laid out to catch Tigers when they exposed their thinner side armor. There were no front lines in the traditional sense, just a network of positions that could isolate and overwhelm the tanks once they were detected. When the Allies finally encountered Tigers in Tunisia in 1943, they did what they always did. The operation began with concentrated artillery bombardment, airstrikes, and flanking maneuvers. Sherman and T-34 tank commanders learned to respect the Tiger's frontal armor and deadly main gun. By the time Allied tanks engaged, they made sure to attack from multiple angles, forcing the Tiger to either expose its sides or be unable to engage all threats simultaneously. But to understand why commanding a Tiger was such a nightmare, we need to take a look at how it actually worked. The Tiger I was the heaviest operational tank in the world when it entered service in 1942. It had 100mm of frontal armor, 80mm on the sides, and an 88mm KWK-36 main gun derived from the deadly anti-aircraft cannon of the same caliber. Connected to it was an advanced optical sight with 2.5x magnification that allowed for unprecedented accuracy at long ranges. But here's the thing. Your effective combat range might be 2 kilometers, but your visibility was severely limited. The commander had to stick his head out of the hatch to properly spot targets, making him vulnerable to snipers and shrapnel. A full ammunition load gave you 92 rounds, which sounds like a lot until you realize that each shell weighed 10 kilograms and had to be manually loaded in cramped conditions after being passed hand to hand through the crew compartment. You had to somehow navigate a 57-ton vehicle with an underpowered 700 horsepower engine across rough terrain, while avoiding soft ground that would swallow your tank whole. Then, when bogged down, you had to hope recovery vehicles could pull you out before enemy artillery zeroed in on your position. Now, once the whole front saw your distinctive interleaved wheel pattern or recognized your boxy silhouette, Allied units knew exactly what a Tiger's presence meant for their survival chances. So, the second they spotted a German tank with that characteristic flat front and large turret, they gave it undivided attention with whatever weapons they had. Artillery would immediately begin firing on likely escape routes. Aircraft would be diverted to target it. The rest of the Allied armor would attempt to maneuver to the Tiger's flanks and rear, targeting the thinner 80mm side armor or even thinner 25mm rear armor, where even a Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate. But with 57 tons of vehicle under your command and a transmission notorious for failing under stress, it was everything but an easy thing to evade these threats. Being captured alive was perhaps a bigger fear than being killed outright, particularly on the Eastern Front. Soviet troops had seen what Tigers did to their comrades and weren't known for treating their crews with mercy. Execution on the spot, if captured, might be the best option you could hope for, especially if you were SS, but usually it was something different, much longer and significantly more painful. There's one story from Kursk when a Tiger threw its track while retreating from a Soviet breakthrough. 2 crew members escaped, but the other 3 were captured by advancing Soviet infantry. The rest of their battalion could hear their screams over the radio as the Soviets found out they were from an SS unit. The other Tigers were ordered to keep retreating, unable to help them, or at least end their misery. And we could only imagine what happened to them. So everything about this tank was terrible on so many levels. From the extreme mechanical unreliability of the weapon itself, as sudden terrain changes or pushing the engine too hard could disable the tank, all the way to the psyche of surviving operators who had to deal with the claustrophobia and constant fear of being surrounded by enemies who specifically targeted them. At that range, you'd pretty much see, hear, and feel the full consequences and effects of your predicament on your fellow crew members. While doing research for this video, I came upon some accounts and photos showing the aftermath of Tiger tank battles. And if you have a strong gut, you could find them to see what I'm talking about, although I strongly don't recommend it. Sometimes Tiger crews used a tactic called Kanteln, or tilting. They would position their tank behind cover with only the turret and gun exposed, basically using natural terrain as additional armor. Then they'd methodically eliminate enemy vehicles one by one while remaining protected. It increased their chances of surviving the engagement without exposing their vulnerable sides and suspension. In confined spaces, the cramped crew compartment would immediately fill with toxic fumes when the gun fired, requiring crew members to wear gas masks during extended engagements. So, even if tankers inside weren't directly hit by enemy fire, they had a slim chance of surviving extended combat due to exhaustion and the hellish conditions. Looking at a Tiger firing on video gives nowhere near the actual impression of how loud and violent it really was inside. Even the commanders were trained to coordinate attack and retreat commands between gun firings, as nobody could hear anything when the main gun discharged inside the confined metal box. But despite all those risks, Tigers were one of the only German weapons that actually gave Allied tank commanders pause in the latter half of the war. Still, with casualty rates that high, the Wehrmacht needed something that could carry that legendary 88mm gun into battle with a bit more reliability and less fuel consumption. That's when they brought in the King Tigers. These were Tiger IIs, even heavier at 68 tons, with sloped armor up to 180 millimeters thick at the front. They looked like oversized panthers from the outside until they fired. They now carried the longer 88mm KWK-43 gun that could penetrate 153 millimeters of armor at 2 kilometers, nearly 40% more than the already formidable Tiger I. These King Tigers operated in coordination with infantry and lighter tanks. But the same as with the original Tigers, once they were spotted, the whole Allied front would concentrate on destroying them, and carrying hundreds of liters of fuel inside a metal box with even more reliability issues was not what tankers found interesting to do. As if they didn't already have enough risks. However, King Tigers were definitely the most feared weapon on the Western Front and played a major role in slowing the Allied advance. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out with subscribing. But let me tell you about what actually happened to these men. On April 12, 1944, a Tiger tank commanded by SS Untersturmführer Michael Wittmann was patrolling near the town of Kovel on the Eastern Front. Wittmann was already a legendary tank ace with over 100 confirmed kills. His Tiger, number 205, had survived dozens of engagements thanks to his skill and the tank's formidable armor. As Wittmann's Tiger approached a small forest, Soviet artillery suddenly opened fire, forcing the tank to take cover behind a small ridge. Unknown to Wittmann, a Soviet IS-2 heavy tank battalion had set up an ambush, waiting for the infamous Tiger to make a move. When Wittmann attempted to reposition, his tank's engine stalled, a common mechanical failure that plagued the Tigers. The massive tank sat helpless as 3 122mm shells from the Soviet heavies slammed into its side armor in rapid succession. The tank didn't explode dramatically as movies might suggest. Instead, the armor was breached, sending superheated metal fragments through the crew compartment like a blender. Of the 5 crew members, only the loader survived, pulled from the burning wreck by German infantry. He died of his wounds 3 days later. Wittmann himself would survive this encounter, only to meet his end months later in Normandy, when his Tiger was ambushed by British Firefly tanks. But this wasn't the only case of Tiger crews facing terrible odds. On January 18, 1943, during the first deployment of Tigers in Tunisia, Lieutenant Hans Ziegler's tank became separated from his unit during a sandstorm. When visibility cleared, Ziegler found himself alone with American M3 tanks approaching from 3 directions. His gunner managed to destroy 4 enemy tanks before a shell jammed their turret traverse mechanism. Unable to turn to face the remaining threats, the Tiger was hit repeatedly in the rear engine compartment. As fire spread toward the ammunition storage, Ziegler ordered his crew to abandon the tank. 2 crew members made it out of the hatches before the ammunition cooked off, killing the other 3 instantly and throwing the turret completely off the hull. The survivors were captured by American forces. But if you think that story was incredible, what happened to Sergeant Klaus Lodel and his crew defies all odds. During the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Lodel's Tiger took a direct hit from a Soviet artillery shell that damaged the turret ring, making the turret unable to rotate. The crew was ordered to abandon the tank, but as they began to exit, Soviet infantry surrounded the vehicle. Rather than surrender, Lodel ordered his crew back inside. For 3 days, the immobilized Tiger served as a stationary pillbox, the crew using the main gun to hold off Soviet attacks while surviving on emergency rations and limited water. The temperature inside the metal hull reached over 50 degrees Celsius during the day, with the crew taking turns manning the machine gun and watching for Soviet tank hunting teams attempting to plant explosives. On the 4th day, with ammunition nearly exhausted and no hope of relief, Lodel made a desperate decision. Under cover of darkness, the crew removed the engine access panels and escaped through the rear of the tank, crawling through Soviet lines. Incredibly, 4 of the 5 crew members managed to reach German positions after a 15-kilometer trek through enemy-held territory. Lodel received the Iron Cross for his leadership, only to die 2 months later when his replacement Tiger threw a track, and was destroyed by Soviet artillery. These stories highlight why Tiger crews suffered such devastating losses. The official numbers are staggering. Of the approximately 1,347 Tigers produced, over 1,150 were lost in combat. Production of new tanks couldn't keep pace with losses, and by 1944, there were never more than 300 operational Tigers on all fronts combined. Even more telling is the human cost. German records show that Tiger units lost an average of 85% of their original crews over the course of their operational deployment, with replacement crews often lasting less than 3 weeks in combat. The 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped exclusively with Tigers, went through complete crew replacements 4 times during its service on the Eastern Front. These catastrophic losses stemmed from multiple factors. The mechanical unreliability meant crews often had to abandon their vehicles even without enemy contact. The strategic importance placed on Tigers made them priority targets for Allied air and artillery strikes. Their limited speed meant they couldn't escape when breakdowns occurred in enemy territory. And, perhaps most critically, the psychological burden of commanding such a feared weapon made Tiger crews fight to the death rather than retreat, knowing the consequences of capture. Despite these horrific casualty rates, the Tiger remained the most feared tank of World War II, a psychological weapon that could break enemy morale by its mere presence. But for the young men sealed inside these steel beasts, it was more often than not a one-way mission into the inferno of modern warfare. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to our channel for more videos about the darkest chapters of military history.